NASA just announced a mission that almost nobody is talking about correctly. Everyone knows Artemis II happened. The flyby, the records, the photographs, the crew coming home. That story has been told. But the story that has not been told properly, the one that actually determines whether humans return to the surface of another world in our lifetimes, is what comes next. Artemis III. And here is the thing. If you go online right now and search for what Artemis III is, you will get answers that range from outdated to completely wrong. Because Artemis III has been fundamentally redesigned. The mission it was supposed to be is gone. What replaced it is something far more complicated, far more honest, and in some ways far more interesting than what it was originally planned to be. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what Artemis III actually is now, why it changed, what it is genuinely trying to accomplish, and what has to happen before any human being sets foot on another world for the first time in over 50 years. No fake information, no speculation presented as fact. Everything in this video is verified from NASA statements, congressional records, and confirmed reporting. Let's get into it. To understand what Artemis III is today, you first need to understand what it was supposed to be. Because the gap between those two things tells you almost everything about the challenges this program is actually facing. When NASA laid out the Artemis program years ago, the plan was a clean three-step sequence. Artemis I would be an uncrewed test flight. Send the rocket and spacecraft to the moon with no crew, prove the hardware works, come home. Artemis II would be the first crewed mission. Send 4 astronauts around the moon. Prove humans can survive and operate in deep space with the new systems. Come home without landing. And Artemis III, that was the crown jewel. The first crewed lunar landing since Apollo 17 in 1972. 2 astronauts on the surface of the moon. The first woman and the first person of color to walk on another world. History made. That was the plan. Artemis I flew in November 2022. It worked, mostly, except for the heat shield problem that caused months of investigation and delayed Artemis II. Artemis II flew on April 1st, 2026. It also worked. The crew broke every distance record in human spaceflight history, flew around the far side of the moon, came home safely on April 10th. And now it is Artemis III's turn. Except Artemis III is not what it was supposed to be anymore. Not even close. On February 27, 2026, just weeks before Artemis II even launched, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman stood in front of cameras and announced that Artemis III would not land on the moon. Not delayed, not pushed back. The landing was removed from the mission entirely and moved to a future flight. Now, the question you are probably asking is why? If the whole point of the Artemis program is to land humans on the moon, why is the third mission in the sequence not landing on the moon? The answer has multiple layers, and each one reveals something uncomfortable about where this program actually is right now. The first layer is the heat shield. You might remember from the Artemis II coverage that Orion's heat shield, the one designed to protect the crew during high-speed re-entry, behaved unexpectedly on Artemis I in 2022. It cracked. It pocked. It eroded in ways that the computer models did not predict. Over 100 locations of unexpected damage. For Artemis II, NASA changed the re-entry trajectory to reduce the thermal stress on the existing shield. They flew the mission with the known problem rather than replacing the heat shield, because replacement would have taken years. And when Artemis II came home on April 10th, the modified approach worked. The crew is safe. But the heat shield problem is not fully solved. The redesigned heat shield, the one that actually addresses the root cause of the material behavior, is planned for a future mission, not Artemis III. A lunar landing mission is dramatically more demanding than a lunar flyby. Coming back from the surface of the moon means entering Earth's atmosphere faster, hitting the heat shield harder, generating more thermal stress. Flying a landing mission with a heat shield that still has unresolved characteristics was a risk profile NASA was not willing to accept. The shield situation alone pushed the mission profile towards something simpler and safer. The second layer is the landers, and this is where the story gets genuinely complex. Here is something most people do not fully understand about how the Artemis landing missions are supposed to work. Orion, the capsule that carries the crew, is not a lunar lander. It never was. It cannot land on the moon. It has no legs, no descent engines, no capability whatsoever to touch down on another world. To actually land on the moon, NASA needs a completely separate vehicle, a human landing system, a purpose-built spacecraft that the crew transfers into while in orbit around the moon, rides down to the surface, lives on for several days, and then uses to launch back up to rendezvous with Orion for the journey home. NASA has contracted 2 private companies to build these landers. SpaceX is building one called Starship HLS. Blue Origin is building one called Blue Moon. Neither one has ever landed on the moon. Neither one has ever carried a human being. As of today, neither one is operational, and both of them have a problem that has never been solved in the history of spaceflight. To reach the moon, these landers need an enormous amount of propellant, far more than can be launched from Earth in a single rocket. So the plan involves launching the lander vehicle to orbit essentially empty, and then sending a series of separate tanker vehicles to fill it up in orbit before it heads to the moon. For SpaceX's Starship HLS, the current plan requires at least 14 separate tanker launches, 14 separate Starship rockets lifting off, one after another, each docking with a propellant depot in Earth orbit and transferring hundreds of tons of super-cold liquid methane and liquid oxygen. 14 sequential launches, 14 separate docking operations, 14 fuel transfers of cryogenic propellant, propellant that has to stay hundreds of degrees below zero in the vacuum of space, propellant that boils off slowly even in the best conditions, propellant that nobody has ever transferred between 2 large spacecraft in orbit, because it has simply never been done before. This is not a small engineering challenge. This is one of the most technically demanding operations ever attempted in spaceflight history, and it needs to work perfectly, 14 times in a row, before a single crew member steps into that lander. As of right now, SpaceX has not completed the orbital propellant transfer demonstration. It was originally planned for 2025. It is now expected in 2026. And it needs to happen and succeed before any crewed mission can depend on the lander being operational. Blue Origin's situation is similar. Their lander design requires orbital refueling too. They have conducted 1 orbital test flight of their New Glenn rocket. The full Blue Moon lander system is still in development. NASA's acting associate administrator said it plainly after Artemis II splashed down. She said NASA needs all of industry to work and come along with them. Companies need to accept that challenge and start the production lines required to achieve the goal. That is not the language of confident schedule confidence. That is the language of a program that knows the private sector has to deliver and is not entirely certain it will. Now we can reveal what Artemis III actually is. Because knowing all of that background, the redesigned mission makes complete sense. Artemis III, currently targeting mid-2027, is not going to the moon. It is staying in Earth orbit. Here is the plan. 4 astronauts launch aboard Orion on top of the Space Launch System rocket. They reach Earth orbit. Separately, one or both of the commercial lunar landers, SpaceX's Starship HLS and Blue Origin's Blue Moon, are launched independently and are already waiting in orbit. The crew in Orion then rendezvous and dock with those landers. They test whether Orion and the lander can actually connect in space. They test the integrated life support systems of the docked vehicles. They test the communication systems. They test propulsion. And they test the new spacesuits, the Axiom Extravehicular Mobility Unit, called the AXEMU, the suits that astronauts will actually wear on the lunar surface when the time comes. This is what the Artemis III mission has become, a systems integration test in Earth orbit. A verification that all the pieces of the moon landing architecture can actually work together before anyone trusts their lives to those pieces at 250,000 miles from home. NASA's own administrator compared it to Apollo 9. In January 1969, Apollo 9 sent 3 astronauts to Earth orbit where they tested the lunar module, the lander, for the first time with humans inside. They tested docking, they tested the suits, they tested the systems. They did not go to the moon. They came home after 10 days in Earth orbit. 2 missions later, Apollo 11 landed on the moon. That is the parallel NASA is drawing. Artemis III is the test that makes the real landing possible. It exists because the technology it is supposed to test does not yet have a clean track record, and you do not stake human lives on unproven technology in one of the most remote, dangerous environments in the solar system without testing it first. Here is where it gets more complicated still, because even the 2027 timeline for Artemis III is not guaranteed. For Artemis III to happen on schedule, several things have to work out in a very specific sequence between now and mid-2027. SpaceX needs to complete its orbital propellant transfer demonstration. They need to show that 14 or more tanker dockings can deliver the required propellant without unacceptable loss to boil-off. This demonstration has already slipped from 2025 to 2026. If it slips further, everything downstream moves with it. One or both landers need to reach Earth orbit in the correct configuration and at the right time to be there when the Orion crew arrives. Coordinating the launch of two entirely separate private spacecraft with a NASA mission involves scheduling complexity that has never been attempted at this scale. The AX-EMU spacesuits need to be certified for actual use. These are not the same suits NASA astronauts have worn for decades. They are custom-built for the lunar environment, designed to work in the extreme cold and extreme heat of the lunar surface, in dust that is extraordinarily corrosive, in conditions that no human has operated in since Harrison Schmitt walked on the moon in December 1972. And Orion itself needs to be built, stacked, and prepared for launch. The SLS rocket core stage components are currently being shipped to Kennedy Space Center, with stacking expected to begin later in 2026. All of that has to come together. None of it can slip significantly without pushing the launch. NASA's acting administrator said something after Artemis II's successful splashdown that is worth paying close attention to. She said it feels like a very small amount of time. That was not false modesty. That was an honest acknowledgement that the margin between now and mid-2027 is thin. But let's talk about what happens if Artemis III works, because that is ultimately the whole reason this program exists. If Orion docks successfully with the landers in Earth orbit, if the integrated systems check out, if the suits perform, if everything that Artemis III is designed to verify actually gets verified, then Artemis IV follows in 2028. And Artemis IV is the mission that changes everything. Two astronauts transfer from Orion into a fully fueled, fully tested lander in lunar orbit. They ride it down to the surface of the moon. They step out. For the first time in over 50 years, human feet touch the regolith of another world. And unlike Apollo, where the longest surface stay was about 3 days, the plan for the Artemis lunar landings is to build toward extended stays, weeks, eventually months, a permanent base at the lunar South Pole, where permanently shadowed craters hold water ice that can be converted into drinking water, breathable oxygen, and, crucially, rocket propellant. The lunar South Pole is not just interesting to scientists. It is potentially the fuel depot that makes everything beyond the moon possible. Because if you can mine water ice, split it into hydrogen and oxygen, and fill rockets with it on the moon, you have changed the economics of deep space exploration permanently. You no longer have to bring all your propellant from Earth. You can refuel at the moon before heading further out. That is the real destination, not the lunar South Pole, not even Mars, though Mars is part of the long-term vision. The real destination is a future where leaving Earth is not a one-way commitment, where refueling is possible at waypoints along the way, where the solar system becomes something that can be navigated rather than merely glimpsed. Artemis III is not that mission, but Artemis III is the mission that decides whether any of that becomes possible on a human timescale. So let's be completely honest about where we are. Artemis II is done. It was a success. 4 astronauts went farther from Earth than any human in history, saw parts of the moon no human eye had seen in 50 years, and came home safely. That chapter is closed. The chapter opening now is harder. Artemis III faces a technical challenge, orbital propellant transfer, that has never been solved at operational scale. It faces a schedule that most people who follow this program closely describe as tight. It faces the reality that 2 commercial landers, built by 2 different private companies, need to be ready, certified, and in orbit before a crewed mission can be designed around them. None of this means the program will fail. NASA and its partners are not starting from zero. Real progress has been made. Starship has flown 11 test flights and demonstrated some critical capabilities. Blue Origin's lander is in production. The AX-EMU suits are in advanced development. The SLS hardware is moving to Florida. But the question the title of this video asked, the truth about Artemis III that nobody is talking about, is this. Artemis III is not the landing everyone was promised. It is the test that decides if the landing becomes possible. That shift happened quietly, announced in a press conference 6 weeks ago, and most of the people following this program still have not fully absorbed what it means. It means the moon is not 2027. The moon is 2028 at the earliest. And 2028 depends on things working out between now and then that have never worked out before in exactly this way. That is not pessimism. That is honesty. And the people at NASA know it. The acting administrator said it herself. A very small amount of time. The question is whether the technology, the companies, the schedule, and the will to keep going all arrive at the launch pad at the same moment. History says it is possible. Apollo 9 flew. Apollo 11 followed. Humans walked on the moon. The question is whether this generation has the same ability to build on imperfect progress, one careful step at a time, until the impossible becomes real. Artemis III is that next careful step. In Earth orbit, in 2027. The moon comes after. If you want to follow every step of this program as it actually happens, not the polished official version, but the real version, the technical challenges and the honest timelines and the moments that matter, subscribe and hit the like button. We're going to cover all of it. Stay curious.